I theorize gendered corruption in government institutions, in this case as gaslighting. So I demonstrate how the practice of gaslighting actually serves to preserve a patriarchal socio-political and economic order, allowing for the accumulation of wealth and power in the hands of predominantly men. And hopefully by the end of this talk, it will become clear why I say predominantly. But I also demonstrate how women, and in this case, NGO practitioners, counter such corruption to enhance democratic practice. And I refer to this type of practice as dispelling. So to give you a bit of a context, I did research in Montenegro, which is a tiny pebble in the Adriatic Sea, counting something just over 600,000 people. And it is deemed by many as a very corrupt environment. So country has deemed to have suffered endemic corruption, as well as the process of rapid repatriarchalization of public sphere ever since the introduction of multi-party democracy in the 90s, or perhaps better to say, ever since the workers' democracy has been replaced by what we now call liberal or neoliberal democracy. According to Freedom House, it is gradually departing from democratic principles of liberty and equality, earning the label of hybrid regime, which is the one that kind of hovers somewhere in between autocratic and democratic. But in terms of gender equality per se, I have to say that Montenegro enjoys quite a comprehensive legal framework. It's really good. Apart from the much improved law on gender equality that will be talking about a bit later, we have also ratified CEDAW Convention and Istanbul Convention. However, because of the poor rule of law reflects in very uneven, very skewed distribution of power and wealth in the country. So just to give you some indication, currently we have only 22 women in the parliament out of 81 MPs. No women currently are leading political parties. 1 in 10, according to the recent research by Women's Rights Center, has reported that a colleague or a superior propositioned them for sex. 5% reported that they have been indeed forced to have sexual intercourse with their colleague or supervisor. And similarly, Office for Cooperation and Security in Europe reported recently that 1 in 5 women experience physical and or sexual violence since the age of 15. And the statistics becomes even denser when we include other forms of abuse, such as economic abuse, for example. The situation is not much better or better at all when it comes to wealth distribution, because as you can tell from the presentation, women are owning nearly 4% of real estate, 24% of small and medium-sized businesses. They represent 60% of unemployed people in the country. They're paid on average significantly less than men across all sectors. And as you can imagine, pregnancy and maternal leave rights are violated on regular basis. So as I said before, I based myself in this tiny but very impactful NGO in Montenegro, which is frequently quoted in national media and sought by numerous international and supranational organizations for its views. And in light of this research, I guess it's important to say that WRC collaborates with government institutions to pursue its equality mission, and they do that by monitoring institutional practice, participating in policy working groups, drafting amendments to legislation, and organizing educational training for mostly police and judiciary. So I started my PhD online, started this research, ethnography online, and I was because I wanted to familiarize myself with the members of this organization, but also with the practice that they do and values that they hold dear. And I have to say that I was really glad that I did that, because by the time I was to join them in fieldwork face to face, I knew so much about the organization already, and they knew so much about me that that transition happened almost seamlessly. And even though I joined as a researcher in that kind of official capacity, very quickly I slipped into the identity of full organizational member, which allowed me kind of full insight in how difficult it is to be an NGO practitioner in such a context. Even though I started making sense of my data throughout the fieldwork, afterwards I employed something called post-structuralist discourse analysis, which is underpinned by principles of performativity, because I chose performativity as my theoretical framework, and because I know we have some PhD students here today, I'll try to surface elements of post-structural discourse analysis when we get to the data, but also please be free to ask questions in the Q&A. In terms of the literature, I broadly relied on these two big kind of bodies of literature. One is gendered corruption, the other one is gaslighting, to make sense of my data. So I started from this baseline definition, which reads organizational corruption in public sphere as the abuse of public office for private gain, where perpetrators engage in differential treatment of particular groups of people and determine what is considered to be unacceptable or illegitimate, as Kate Kenny says. And in such a context, women and women's NGO in particular in new democracies are viewed as a panacea against corruption. They are referred to as watchdogs against government abuses, as vehicles for democratization, because they're deemed to be kind of more ethical and able to kind of push and prod governments to become more transparent. But you know, even if that those kind of stereotypical statements weren't to hold true, I think it's fair to kind of observe corruption as always gendered, and this is because, to kind of to quote Cravani and Lenefors, it's because the public sphere globally and in Montenegro as well is dominated by men who are given precedence in interpreting reality, and it is a reality in which patriarchal relations reproduce practices that are unequal, restrictive, and corrupt. So when corruption serves one gender at the expense of others, that makes it a very gendered phenomenon. And these dynamics are evident in both autocratic environments, but also those three kind of treated non-authoritarian but nevertheless corrupt settings, where kind of gendered nature of corruption is evident in subtle ways. So for instance, we probably all heard about these covert forms of clientelism or associations of patronage, where men support one another through you know, networks of quid pro quo relations, which entrench inequality in formal democracies. And such practice bears very material, very tangible consequences for women. But the routinization of gender biases through everyday social norms can make these much harder to identify, much like gaslighting, which is another kind of body of literature that I reached for in order to be able to make sense of what I observed. So gaslighting as a term was first adopted by psychologists to describe abuse that usually takes place within intimate relationships and predominantly by men over women. And then from there on, it seeped into kind of popular media and mainstream literature to describe a practice of masculine control where a gaslightee is made to feel crazy. And since recently, gaslighting has started to be treated from sociological perspective, and one prominent paper there is that by Sweet, who already started unearthing and surfacing some of the kind of dimensions of practice of gaslighting. So, for instance, for Sweet, gaslighting is rooted in broader social inequalities, which implies the possibility for the translation of those from that macro level into micro level strategies of abuse in three ways. So first, she said the gaslighting relies on structural and institutional inequalities, making vulnerable groups, often women, susceptible to victimization. And this is because women do not typically have that cultural, economic, and political capital to make themselves more resistant or impervious to gaslighting. Second, gaslighting for Sweet mobilizes both power unequal and intimate relationships. And in the context of my research in Montenegro, which is, as I said, a very small country, institutional representatives and NGO workers know one another well through repeated work interactions, but also familiar and sometimes friendships ties. And government workers often capitalize on such connections, creating this friendly, familiar, paternalistic atmosphere, only to enact corrupt practice when NGOs drop their guard. And third, according to Sweet, gaslighting leverages power and intimacy to reinforce gender bias through applying various stereotypes. Gaslighting has been so far theorized in different kind of contexts, in prisons, in courts, and more recently by Honig in politics, in the sphere of formal politics. But surprisingly, none of these theorizes gaslighting as corruption, even though you can read from all these works that gaslighting is being applied with the intention to secure some kind of benefit, being power or wealth or both. And kind of another thing that is missing from these studies of gaslighting is more detail on how to understand and how to interpret the struggles struggles and unfolding of its institutional / organizational forms in practice, which suggests the value for a more performative lens, performative perspective. So in interpreting my data, I relied heavily on Judith Butler's theory of performativity because I wanted to kind of enable me to kind of surface the enactment of corruption and how it bears on the bodies and subjectivities of women. And in particular, I found three concepts from her theory suitable: reiterative norms, recognition, and embodiment. And this is because Butler's account of reiterative norms helped me understand how corruption can get normalized, but also how the norm or norms, corrupt norms, can be turned against themselves to spawn re-articulation that call into question its hegemonic force. And this is a bit kind of more perhaps challenging to understand. So especially if you haven't read Butler, so because of our PhD students, I'll try to provide an example. So in Montenegro, to explain this, how a norm can be turned against itself to kind of create something new. So in Montenegrin context, succumbing to public pressure, Montenegrin legislators drafted a law on gender equality. However, because because they are mostly patriarchal and don't believe in gender equality, they drafted a law which doesn't include sanctions for breaking it, which basically meant that no one can be punished for non-compliance. And this seemed to reconfirm the norm of patriarchal dominance in Montenegrin society. However, this did not stop NGO practitioners citing the provision of the law to draw attention to gender equality violations within and outside government institutions. So such citing emphasized the prevalence of inequality as defined by legislators themselves, right? A practice that ultimately led to the adoption of a series of sanctions that are not now legally codified. So norms that can therefore be contested from within their own logic, thus spawning adaptations, or they can be undermined by others, necessitating adaptation. Recognition was kind of important to me because not only because one's sense of self derives from norms, but because it allowed me to see how norms can make certain subjects and certain practices more or less intelligible or completely unintelligible or socially unaccepted. So, for instance, in context of this research, being recognized as someone who is entitled to speak and enact agency is a foundational basis for the intervention of NGO practitioners. But, this legitimation this recognition must come from the very corrupt actors they seek to challenge. And this presented a key tension, both in practice and in my research. And finally, the concept of embodiment was very useful for me to surface the toll that fighting corruption has on women, and taught me that to never separate body from language, because when we speak, we also perform something. So, for instance, language privileging male offspring in Montenegrin public and private domains has a very tangible effect on the bodies of women who are pressured to abort female pregnancies, right? So that kind of taught me never to kind of separate language from the body. Right, finally, so we are getting there gradually. So we came to the data. So just to give you a bit of a context there as well, practitioners often complained about feeling crazy or participating in a parallel reality to that of institutional representatives. So they would list examples of agreements and action points made with government representatives, which would then be completely ignored in practice as if they had never existed, and practitioners made to feel lost and confused. And when institutional representatives were challenged, they would routinely play victim, claiming that they were being bullied by unhinged NGO practitioners. And they would do it so persistently and convincingly, so much so that practitioners would kind of often second guess their actions, memories of events, evidence, which is why I term such instances as gaslighting, to capture the often abstract and obscure and surreal performances of corrupt actors. And I will try to kind of help you. I would talk you through dimensions of gaslighting practice through an first episode, which I kind of titled "Am I Going Mad?" because it's my own experience with gaslighting. However, I will also kind of show you what it looks like when you are more adept at fighting corruption through another episode called "Brutalizing the Police," where a more experienced practitioner fought kind of gaslighting off. So the practice of dispelling denotes the perseverance and stamina of NGO practitioners in finding a way through. Dispelling means to drive away in different directions or in scattered order, to disperse by force or dissipate. And I chose it for its evocative power precisely to signal practice of undoing the spell. So I'm going now to kind of first introduce you to different dimensions of practice of gaslighting. And then I am going to talk you through this first episode. Am I going mad? But I'm going to leave this in front of you, just, you know, so we can maybe together try to identify the dimensions in the episode that I'm going to introduce you to. So the first dimension is ruling, and this denotes the introduction of very arbitrary and unspoken rules into procedures and spaces with the purpose of inhibiting any kind of meaningful participation or discussion. The second dimension is exposing, and this denotes this is about making practitioners appear very inept in front of an audience when they challenge corrupt practice. Weaponizing victimhood is probably my favorite. This is Onion, by the way. I didn't know what to use as an icon, so kind of fake tears. Weaponizing victimhood. It's when institutional representatives assume the status of victim, realigning boundaries in the process. So by assuming the status of a victim, they automatically render you a bully. And finally, collective affirmation denotes shifting the practice of gaslighting to a collective level through drawing in the wisdom of a crowd to affirm the logic and sense of otherwise senseless and corrupt practice. Or in layperson terms, it's basically ganging up on you when you challenge corrupt practice. So to give you a bit of the context, the first episode derives from the event I participated in as an NGO practitioner / researcher. I joined this roundtable discussion with government representatives about a newly produced commentary on the gender equality law. It's the same gender equality law I mentioned earlier. So this was a commentary produced on a very flawed law at the time by the political appointees of a corrupt regime who were now trying to rush it through civil society without proper scrutiny. But documents like these, commentaries like these, are normally drafted with stakeholders who have experience with law's application in practice, such as NGO practitioners, just with the simple purpose of improving it. So with the purpose of identifying loopholes, strengthening provisions, and so on. So I was surprised to learn that in this case, the authors of the law were also the sole commentators on its application. And moreover, no one present apart from the authors had seen the document before. But I learned that the hard way, right? So I'm sitting in this huge oval room together with government representatives and some NGO representatives. And I see what looks like a book in front of each participant. It's the commentary. And I'm mildly panicked because I'm thinking, if there's a published book in front of me, well, there must have been a draft that NGOs were invited to comment on, right? But I tried to reason it out. It must be a misunderstanding. Someone in the room will clarify it. But everyone around the room seemed to be calm and unalarmed. I reach for the agenda to find some clues, but there's nothing there. Panic spikes. I desperately reread the agenda as I could not believe that government representatives could stage a discussion about something no one was familiar with. Doubting my own judgment at this point, I text Lana, an NGO practitioner, to confirm that We have never received a commentary, to which she said that each time they asked, they received the same response. The document is not ready for distribution. So the intro to the event is wrapped up and the audience chimes in. And what I hear are variants of the same praise and admiration for the documents, so a form of collective affirmation. But they haven't read it. No one here has. Have they? No, not one person posed the obvious question, obvious to me. What does the commentary actually say? Finally, I muster courage to raise my hand, only to realize that I'm invisible, my request rendered unintelligible in whatever rules the facilitator had established. She eventually acknowledges my request, but continues to ignore me for a while, which made me feel exposed because my persistence in raising my hand was drawing lots of disapproval. Subsequently, I learned that this was common practice, governed by socially instituted and maintained norms of intelligibility, to borrow from Butler, where institutional representatives render certain participants invisible and irrelevant through the subtle tactics of ruling deliberation spaces with their arbitrary routines, as well as making people question the appropriateness of their actions. For example, was my hand raised enough? Did I formulate my request clearly? Such questions, combined with the selection of nouns and adjectives I assigned to myself in my journal, invisible, irrelevant, nuisance, awkward, signaled the inception of doubt in myself as a legitimate source of reason. The ruling dimension, therefore, performed an important function in gaslighting practice. It is through assigning arbitrary rules to practice that power imbalances that Sweet was talking about are underlined and secured. So it's basically a platform upon which other aspects of gaslighting can unfold. So after a while, a facilitator finally approached and asked if I could allow a ministry representative to comment first. I agreed, but wanted to know why. She's from the ministry, she enunciated, expecting me to understand, which I admit I did not at the time. Another spoken rule. Visibly irritated, she passed the microphone over my shoulder. So it was reverence for higher authority that informed the practice of the facilitator, establishing what Stark defines as a power differential between the gaslighter and his target. So by insisting to be heard, I threatened to disrupt the normative order at play through what Butler would call enduring moment of resistance. Because the topic was equality, yet the entire event was ruled by unequal practice. Speakers used the masculine gender as a form of neutral gender, a practice legally sanctioned by the same law that was being discussed, ironically. So notable here is how citing the patriarchal convention in the context of discussing gender equality law sets the discursive conditions for gaslighting. Such citation expose precisely what is excluded from them, and in this case, signaling masculine authority within a space designated for women. Finally, I get the chance to ask the conveners to elaborate on their rationale for being the sole commentators of the law, as well as to explain why they didn't share it in advance. The main speaker shot me a lingering and perplexed look, exposing me as foolish for asking. She scanned the room for more support, which she received in the forms of many eyes rolled and sighs exhaled, gaining collective affirmation for my foolishness. Despite my best effort to appear undeterred, my body exceeded my intentions, to quote Butler. My palms were sweating with anxiety because the body language of the speaker and others impressed upon me that I had asked something entirely stupid, a feeling common amongst targets of gaslighting. After a long pause, she smiled innocently and said, "Sorry, I don't understand," which made me feel as though the fault was mine for not keeping up. So I scrambled to correct myself. When I posed my question again, she shrugged and apologized for simply not understanding, her facial expression appearing confused, as if I were speaking a foreign language. And this is akin to Stark's practice of sidestepping, which involves ridiculing or belittling the accuser for making the accusation. And this was a quote. Although in my case, this took place implicitly and was achieved as a collective endeavor between facilitator and audience. So seeing the microphone being carried away, I temporarily woke up from my self-doubt and shouted across the room, "You wrote the law, and now you've written a commentary on your own, but no one knows what aspects of the law you commented on because no one was given the chance to read it. Care to comment?" She was startled by this and provided some clumsy response about the document not being printed in time, making offended and hurt facial expressions, glancing around the room for more collective affirmation. She was assuming the identity of victim, I realized later, even weaponizing victimhood, which would in turn render me a bully. Before I could continue, people started praising the commentary as one of the best documents, affirming their respect for the authors. But by this point, I was bathing in adrenaline and had lost all sense of propriety, so I shouted back like a feisty drunkard, "How the hell do you know when you haven't read it?" Yet instead of the kind of cinematic resolution I was hoping for, where the audience cracks under the burden of a pointed question and admits the fallacy of the staged event, my voice, alongside my sense of pride, was drowned out by a cacophony of odes to the commentary. Basically, I was made to feel crazy, and then I acted crazily, confirming the identity subtly assigned to me. So I'm going to stop with this episode here because of the time. There were more, but I want to also kind of walk you through dimensions of dispelling, so you can see how practitioners are forced to be vigilant, to stay ahead of corrupt practices and to dispel those already enacted. So there are also 4 dimensions to dispelling practice. So reiteration denotes repetition of the same message, almost verbatim, in order to kind of as a tool to refocus discussion on the needs of marginalized people. Presenting evidence is quite self-explanatory, so it's introduction of reports, analysis, witness statements, and so on, again, with the purpose of refocusing discussion. The third one is tactical withdrawal, where women consciously concede to an unfair or inaccurate criticism and sometimes even absorb abuse in order to redirect the conversation back to the area of concern. And finally, women seek to dispel corrupt practice by provoking empathetic feelings from institutional representatives. So again, I'm going to leave this in front of you and see if you can spot it in the second episode. So the second episode comes from an NGO practitioner, Nela, and her experiences of seeking justice for victims of domestic violence. So Nela challenged a police officer for exposing a victim of domestic violence to further abuse. The victim was a minor, so the police could not take a statement in the absence of a representative from the Center for Social Protection. Yet instead of advising the victim to contact the center, the officer stated in the report that there were no legal grounds for undertaking further action and sent the victim home to more abuse. When Nela reacted to this negligence, the police officer deflected by accusing Nela of verbal attack. So this was an instance of weaponizing victimhood and inversion of roles common in gaslighting. So I listened to Nela asking for an explanation, reiterating the legal obligations of police officers, but there were 2 parallel dialogues unfolding really. Nina was talking about the case, performatively repeating the provisions from the law, and the police officer was talking about Nina's disrespect of the police. And the conversation shifted entirely from the main topic to the character of the target, in this case, Nina. And each time Nina had to employ denial as an instrument for the refusal of recognition, to quote Butler, by those she deemed corrupt, patiently comparing the police report with the victim's statement and explaining the legal obligations of the police in dealing with minors, a form of reiteration, an attempt to assert a different democratic normative order. At the time, I was struck by her calm expose, especially because she was kind of absorbing a lot of sexist abuse at the time. We'll get to that. But she explained in an interview later that it was important to stay composed, as it is their tactic to provoke you into losing your temper so they can dismiss you as crazy. So you have to suppress whatever it is that you feel, even when your blood boils. So to combat gaslighting, she used what Butler refers to as speech that occludes the body, a corporeal response to the corruption. She continued to present the evidence calmly, as if a proper dialogue was unfolding, yet the officers continued to sidestep evidence, acting as if they had not heard a word. They would continue steering a different dialogue, placing guilt upon Nina like a song caught in a loop. So here is the short excerpt between Nina and police officers, so you can maybe kind of track some of the kind of dimensions of gaslighting taking place here. So Nina said, I think we are at risk of losing track of the real issue here, which is the illegal practice and how we can prevent it from happening in the future. Civic monitor, this is the person that oversees the practice, the police practice. Nina, there's no need for raised voices. We are all friends here. Nina, who's raising a voice? I'm just police inspector. Nina cares about her clients, and sometimes that leads her to react explosively. As a woman, she can sometimes be too emotional and can act irrationally. But she has to understand that we are on the same side. Another police officer. I'm not a child she can yell at. I have feelings. I did my job conscientiously. She's too aggressive. So in this extract, you could see perhaps how different dimensions of gaslighting intersect. The representatives first expose Nina as unstable when she raises the issue of the minor, and then collectively affirm this description through coordinated remarks. And it is through the act of ruling that Nina becomes the main topic of this meeting, through the unspoken collective decision to use time and space reserved for discussing a complex case of abuse for an analysis of an apparently deviant behavior of Nina. So she's portrayed as a bully, as someone who raises her voice, acts explosively, is too emotional, irrational, who yells at friends, disregards their feelings, and is too aggressive. And simultaneously, the officer and civic monitor are portrayed as victims who suffer Nina's irrational outbursts. So it is interesting to note here the repetition of the noun friends, rooted in longer-term familiarity between the actors, denoting a sort of intimacy, but intimacy that is employed as a pacifying and patronizing tactic by the police inspector and civic monitor, positioning Nina as someone who needs calming as they are on the same side. So such positioning serves to transform Nina's objection to the police malpractice into a personal conflict. So the exposition stages a polarity between the good guys, police, and villain, Nina. And the case of the minor is pushed aside through the concerted action of police officers and civic monitor. But unlike the previous episode, where I was quite overcome by gaslighting, Nela was more adept at dispelling corrupt practice. She calmly presented evidence in the face of continuous sexist accusations as a ritual reiterated under and through constraint, to quote Butler. Time was passing, and the conference was locked in endless repetition of two distinct normative frameworks, attacks from the police and evidence from Nela. It was a game of endurance, a tactic designed to distract the target and others from attending to evidence, to borrow from Stark. To everyone's relief, one of the inspectors finally suggested a resolution where Nela must understand that the police officers are made of flesh and blood, suggesting that Nela should be gentler in communication. And this precisely was the cracking gaslighting practice that Nela had been waiting for. So absorbing attacks, like sexist attacks, and accepting blame was the only way to refocus the case, to refocus on the case. This is an example of tactical withdrawal where Nela could see no point in confronting gaslighting head-on, as that would mean more time and energy wasted, and instead absorbed attacks to try to transition to the topic they had gathered to address in the first place. Through tactical withdrawals, therefore, bodies emerge as the site of discriminatory, exclusionary practices and violence, to quote Futaki et al. The collateral damage of countering corrupt practice. So as the conversation continued, Nela used the opportunity to instigate an emotional response from the challenged officer. She started painting a detailed picture of the history of violence the minor and her mother had sustained, presenting evidence to describe the consequences of such life for victims, urging the officer to imagine such violence happening to her own daughter. And by doing this, Nela was seeking to instigate compassion by invoking the recognition of what Butler would call human vulnerability and our collective responsibility for the physical lives of one another. The people's body language visibly changed, signaling potential for the corrupt norm to go awry, to deviate from its seamless repetition. The officer dropped her eyes, blood rushing to her cheeks. Now, sensing this small glitch in the reiterative cycle of the norm, Nela offered help in a carefully worded question denoting unity. How can we assist you in improving practice, driving on our experience? So this could be understood as further tactical withdrawal, framing the question around collective improvement of practice to avoid placing blame on the officer in order to gain justice for the victim. And I think I'm going to stop here with data so that I can kind of draw out some of the concluding thoughts on gaslighting and dispelling. So the first one to mention is gender of gaslighter, and you probably noticed that women can be as adept gaslighters and as men. So there was no clearly delineated and universal subject of a victimized woman gaslit by an unambiguous patriarchal man. But there were both men and women entangled in patriarchal norms and counter norms enacted through embodied engagement. But, this is not to say that women are, this is not to say that women are equally responsible for, enacting corruption as men. Because I want to also draw attention to the power of patriarchal normative dictate to turn women into very committed soldiers of patriarchy and to turn women against women. And even though women indeed emerged as very, capable gaslighters, it is still worth underlining that such corrupt practice works in the service of patriarchy and to maintain the status quo where most of the power and wealth rests with men. And in terms of power imbalance and intimacy, I guess the contribution of this study is to kind of add to that a broad sociological reading of power that reaches beyond intimate relationships, but it also informs them, to kind of to empirically enrich our understanding how intimacy can be actually generated in the public sphere. And even in other contexts, I hope that you managed to draw parallels between your own experiences and this study. But even though I said Montenegro is a small country which kind of allows for these intimate bubbles to be created, I think it's safe to say that we all work in our own bubbles. So it is possible to see how intimacy can be indeed generated in the public sphere. Finally, gaslighting should be understood as corruption. So a practice that goes beyond interpersonal abuse. So when it takes place in public sphere, gaslighting emerges as an abuse of power. And it's important to remind ourselves that gaslighting is always performed for the purpose of gaining a benefit, be it tangible, such as material wealth, intangible, such as gaining power, or a mix of two. Some final kind of thoughts on dispelling. I guess dispelling could be understood, the practice of dispelling could be understood as infrapolitics or infrapolitical practice that Luciani and Paul beautifully wrote about. And this is because, as you've seen in this final episode, sometimes it doesn't pay off to attack corruption head on. But I guess my contribution here is to kind of surface the toll that it takes, to enact such infrapolitical activity. So corruption matters at the level of the bodies of practitioners who lose sleep, experience anxiety and exhaustion, absorb abuse, all with that single purpose of kind of enhancing democratic practice and trying to kind of make government officials keep their word, keep their keep to their constitutional provisions of liberty and equality. And my favorite contribution, I guess, with this study is this reappropriating appropriations. We all know about the kind of feminist slogan, personal is political. Well, a hallmark of gaslighting is the making personal of the political. So it's an inversion of feminist organizing logic. Hence, weaponizing victimhood is basically a reduction of a political point that every woman and every victim deserves fair and equal treatment to a personal issue concerning the feelings of government employees. And with this, I will close this talk. So this is us, there's me somewhere there, marching past the government building on the International Women's Day. So thank you very much.
Hi, Nela. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. So, well done for being able to present such rich data and theorization and keeping the time, because I could see you could have talked much more, but it was really extremely interesting. So I have a few questions, but I'll keep to stick within my role of moderating this. And we have a number of colleagues who have attended. So if you want to speak, you can raise your hand. Otherwise, please post in the chat box. So we have here an initial question from Searcher, which I will read for everyone. So I quote, "As corruption is always gendered, Olufemi Taiwo's work on elite capture may resonate with the practice of gaslighting here." Question mark.
Well, I haven't read their work, but yeah, I would be definitely interested in reading it, because yeah, I guess all forms of corruption known to us, elite capture or state capture or bribery or clientelism, I think all of them have a gendered component to them, and I guess. I guess that one of the points of this research was to say, when we discuss corruption in any context, it is really important to kind of highlight that gendered dimension of it, because you know how that saying during the pandemic, we are all in this together. Sure, but some of us are more in it than others. So yeah, I think it's important that we draw attention to these differences. Oh, thanks, Christina. That's really nice of you.
So, okay, so we have a hand raised. So Saoirse is raising their hand. So please, Saoirse, talk.
First, fabulous presentation, Nela. I think everyone's just like saying that in the chat. It's an absolutely wonderful presentation. It's probably, I mean, your presentation about gaslighting resonated a lot for me because I'm a victim of domestic violence and abuse. One aspect of the DVA that I've suffered for the last 15 odd years is the way that the perpetrator makes the victim feel like it's the victim who is the cause of the DVA. And I think that came through to me in the first example that you read out. And it becomes really interesting that this is going on at an organisation and institutional level as well, where NGOs are actually sitting there saying things like, if only I was better at doing this, then we would get a better response from the government. And it's exactly what you do as a victim of DVA. You sit there saying, if only I was a better person, this person wouldn't be victimizing me. They wouldn't be screaming abuse at me. And it goes on so much. But it also becomes this thing of how you then manage to extract yourself from that, to realize it's not you that's the fault, that you are actually being victimized.
Yeah, that's a really pertinent question, and I guess it is through experience first and foremost. But you know, if now, having known and experienced how gaslighting feels, and seeing other kind of more experienced NGO practitioners at work, I think I'm more equipped to recognize it and fight against it. But yes, I mean, I think just because it's such an evasive practice, it's so difficult to pin it down. I guess we are always a danger of being kind of victims, finding ourselves being victims of it. And I suppose it's also, you know, I mean, in your case in particular, so for instance, and I'm sorry that you went through all the abuse, but in kind of context of organizations and context of institutions, certain, you know, certain kind of subjectivities, certain people are not even intelligible under the legal framework. They just don't exist. So there's that level of gaslighting, pretending that, you know, certain subjectivities such as, I don't know, trans people, non-binary people, minorities, refugees, you know, that these people don't exist. And then there is kind of being recognized as intelligible to a degree, and where you can engage with institutional representatives, in this case, or organization, in others, but where you have to still fight against these invisible windmills. So I suppose the only solution that I can offer is learning from the experiences of others, and then doing the kind of research that we kind of did. So that we are doing, sorry. That's the only kind of hope. I hope that's some consolation.
Teresa, do you want to follow up?
Just to, if I may, before that, I just spotted a comment from Michaela. So yeah, she said, I found it easier to fight against gaslighting when I share my experiences with others. It legitimizes for me the very sense of self that the perpetrator is trying to remove. Though I should say that I am talking about institutional abuses rather than domestic ones, where such support and community is clearly often very deliberately taken away. And this is really the core. So what gaslighters take away from us is that kind of belief in ourselves as a valid, rational, interlocutors. So once you start doubting in yourself as a source of reason, that's when you kind of, not that you know, but that's when the gaslighting is taking root. And I hope that people were able to recognize dimensions of gaslighting and dispelling in other contexts as well, other than institutions.
Great. Thank you. This was really, really interesting. Any additional questions, comments? Ilaria, did you want to, you raised your hand, so please go ahead, Ilaria.
Thank you. I absolutely love this talk. It's been so inspiring and really, really resonated. I loved particularly your link with intimacy beyond intimate relationships. And I was wondering whether you had experienced or witnessed gaslighting or other forms with allies or fake allies, so to speak, like people who pretend to be, your ally or your friend, and then actually they are the perpetrators of that.
Oh gosh, so many times. Thank you for raising that question, because that's precisely what makes it difficult to spot gaslight. Well, to recognize that you are being gaslit, because it does often come from allies. So being in this room, surrounded by people who claim to be very invested, those are the people that wrote the gender equality law. So they must be on your side. You must be allies. Those are the same people that Women's Rights Center reports with, to CEDAW, that is Convention against Elimination of Violence Against Women, Discrimination and Violence Against Women. Yeah, it's a UN body that NGOs and governments report to. So seemingly that puts you on the same side, fighting the same fight for the good cause of attaining equality. But actually, it's yeah. So what makes it hard is seeing them as your kind of frenemies. You have to collaborate together, and yet, in order to preserve their positions and in order to stay in power, I suppose they have to enact gaslighting. There's a line that they might draw in standing between our missions, ours and theirs.
Thank you, Nela. I see a question from Struan, so I'm going to read it for everyone. Hi, Nela. Thank you so much for sharing this study. A question relating to the paper itself. In the text, you mentioned that Nina, like other staff at the NGO, shared mutual friends and family members with authority figures who you observed her countering. Do you have thoughts on why or what appeals to such familiarities weren't drawn on in the practice of dispelling?
Yeah, well, that's by the way, Struan is one of my amazing PhD students, everyone. Thanks for that wonderful question, Struan. Yeah, so I don't want to say that Nina had kind of familiar or friendship ties, but in general, that was kind of the case between NGO practitioners and government representatives. Because it's such a, as I said, it's a country that in terms of population is the size of Bristol, to put it in perspective, and a third of that population lives in the capital. So we all know one another, basically. So to answer your question, why they didn't draw on these links, is precisely for this reason, because even though it's not spoken about openly, government government representatives know that we know each other and that we are closely tied, and they always act on these kind of links of familiarity to undermine you. So one of the tactics of NGO practitioners was to create a distance, some distance in between them, especially in working groups, and you know, to signal it through the language. And it's very hard for me to explain it in English, but it's through the form of address that kind of distance is usually attempted. I don't know how well that actually happens in practice, how successfully that happens in practice. But yeah, through forms of address, the NGO practitioners would try to enact that distance to say, well, thank you for being my friend, or it's lovely that we know one another for a long time, but I have a mission to here today, to enact. So so yeah, I think it would be then against their policy and against their ethical principles to kind of play on these familial ties or friendship ties. But great question. Yeah, thank you for posing it, because it did allow me to mention these linguistic kind of tactics that they assume.
Thank you. Really, really interesting. So let's see if other colleagues have questions. Otherwise, I might have one. So I thought this was really fascinating, and your use of Butler is really, really extremely interesting. My question is, yeah, no, but also your use of it is really, really relevant, and you do it really well. I have a basic question. So about corruption, and norms and social norms, basically. I suppose in particular contexts, the way corruption is seen in a typical liberal Western state doesn't really apply, because you would have, let's say, norms that are just different. So then the very notion of corruption becomes problematic. So I don't know, because I'm not an expert in mafia and stuff, but I suppose in particular communities where mafia has replaced the state, can you really talk about corruption because the dominant institution is no longer the state, it becomes something else. So my question is, could you say a bit more about corruption and those patron-client networks? Do they really replace the state or not really? And if you asked the people who were in your ethnography, and including the problematic people, what is your definition of corruption? Would they agree that they are basically stealing from the state, or would they see it as something legitimate in their inner self? Or perhaps it's just a question that is based on dichotomies that don't make any sense on practice. So basically, just a bit more context on corruption in Montenegro. I suppose that's my question.
Oh, well, yes, I recognize that norms around democracy and corruption are different in different contexts, and it's you know, I kind of use those basic definition that it is kind of abuse of power for personal interest. But actually, thank you for raising that question, because one definition that is perhaps more powerful for me comes from Levine, 2005, who defined corruption as perversion of trust, right? Perversion of trust. And why that resonated particularly strongly with me as a woman is because you have all these guarantees, guarantees to do with liberty and equality granted to you by constitution, granted to you then by laws and different conventions. And yet, as you've seen from that kind of contextual data that I presented in Montenegro, how that then reflects in terms of distribution of power and wealth in the real world tells a completely different story. So it is a perversion of trust, I think, in any context where you have such huge discrepancies between genders in terms of power and wealth. It is essentially a perversion of trust that you have in that constitution, that you have in these laws. And whether that's kind of stealing from states, well, that's then assuming that state is this inanimate thing that exists aside from people that represent it. Whereas, yeah, I think that people make the state. Yeah, so so it is them then that I would blame for perversion of that trust and for that skewed distribution of power and wealth. I also recognize that norms might be enacted differently in different contexts, but I kind of do believe in the